we're moving toward the end of the Easter season, the last 2 weeks. And as we move to the end, the tone of the readings changes. And so we have now not so much the Acts of the Apostles, which is the first reading. It really is the Acts of only 2 apostles, pretty much Peter and then Paul. And now we have Paul's mission, because the way Luke organized his gospel is geographically. It began in Galilee, and then into Samaria, and then down to Judea, Jerusalem, and then it began to spread from Jerusalem out to Samaria, up to Galilee, and then beyond. And so you have this geographical movement, and now Paul is in Asia Minor. He's in a place called Philippi, which is, as the Acts said, a Roman colony. And Paul is reaching out to the Gentiles. But the Gentiles that he first reached out to were not just pagans. Actually, they were called proselytes. Paul went out looking for a place of prayer. And that meant not that he was looking for a quiet place where he could pray, but he was looking for a place where maybe there was a Jewish community that gathered, because they didn't always have special places, synagogues. Some of them just had places where they gathered to pray. And there were a number of people who lived in ancient times who were attracted to Judaism. They really were. It was a religion that made sense. If you look at paganism, especially Roman and Greek paganism, you have this mythology of these gods and goddesses and how they act very human. They're very capricious at times. They're just kind of, why do you do this? Because, I ticked off the god somehow, or the goddess, and she's mad at me. So now I have to win back her favor. And it's just kind of like, really, what kind of religion is that? And with Judaism, it's the first religion of a book. They actually have a text that they use called the Torah. And this is where they find God's revelation, and they study it, and they talk about what it says, and it's consistent in that sense, especially because all synagogues were run by Pharisees, not the Sadducees. They were in Jerusalem with the temple, but the synagogue movement was a part of the Pharisaic movement in Judaism. And so there was a consistency there. And it was very attractive to people who felt an urge toward God, but didn't like what they saw in paganism. And so there was a large number of people that actively were sought out by these who ran the synagogues, offered them the opportunity to become Jews as well. And it was a very attractive thing at the time. There were, it seems, a large number of what we call the proselytes, those who we would call them catechumens today. They were in the process of joining, and so they were familiar with the scriptures that the Jewish people studied over and over again. They sat in the synagogues and listened to the rabbis preach. They understood what was being said, and they had a good grasp of that. And so when Paul comes and starts talking to these proselytes, but tells them Jesus is the fulfillment of all of this, all of a sudden it goes, yeah, this all makes sense. Because there's all the background there already, so that these people willingly accept the gospel of Christ. And so we have the story of Lydia. But what's interesting is, obviously from her name, she is not Jewish. She is Greek. And she is pretty well off. She's a dealer in purple, which was an expensive kind of thing, high end is what we would call it today. And so, she was the one that purple was a rare color, and so, it was used just for fringes and stuff. It wasn't something that you would wear a whole lot of it because it was very expensive. And so she was pretty well off. And so after she accepted the gospel, then she invited Paul to live with her. Not, it was just to have a place to stay, which was interesting because she'd been a Gentile. And from the youngest ages, Jewish people were taught to stay away from the Gentiles. You didn't eat with them, you did business with them, but that's as far as it went. There was no friendships with them, there was no intermarriage with them. It was something that they always kept their distance. And you know, Paul, who had been a rabid Pharisee, all of a sudden is changing. And the question is, how do you explain that? And the only way that it can be explained is by the power of the Holy Spirit. You know, the Spirit acting in Paul helped him to see things, just like in the story we heard on Sunday's reading about Peter's experience with Cornelius. You know, he saw the Holy Spirit come on these people, these Gentiles, and said, well, you know, how can we argue against the Holy Spirit? In the gospel, we have Jesus saying, I will send you the Spirit. I will send you the advocate, because I'm going to tell you, friends, it's not going to be easy to follow me. It's just not going to be easy. There's going to be all kinds of trouble along the way, and you're going to have to make you're going to have to make choices at times that will put you at odds with even those you love. But I will send you the Spirit to help you do that. You and I, pardon me, in these last days of the Easter season, now turn our attention to Pentecost and the coming of that Spirit, so that we can reflect more and more on what the Spirit does in our life. Because if we can recognize the fingerprints of God's Spirit on our life, if we can look back and say, oh, that was no coincidence, that was God directing me here, that was no coincidence, that was God directing me there, then we become more attuned to that power of the Spirit in our life, in our everyday. And it is in that power of the Spirit that you and I are called to be led, so that through the twists and turns and the trials and the struggles, we might grow in our relationship with the Lord. And so in these final days of the Easter season, we reflect on how the Lord, who suffered, died, rose, and ascended, is still with us in the power of His Spirit that guides and directs us, so that that Spirit can affect us as it did Peter, as it did Paul, as it did so many down through the centuries, forming us more and more in the image